November 18, 1942, dawned clear above Hendersonfield, Guadalcanal. Japanese fingers gripped the control stick tighter. The unnamed Zero pilot stared through his canopy glass. Below him spread the blood-soaked island. Above him climbed something impossible. Strange twin-boomed shapes rose from the American airfield. These fighters defied everything he knew about aerial combat. Their climb rate shocked him. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. The 339th Fighter Squadron pilots were making history that morning. They became the first Lightning crews to engage Japanese fighters in combat. This moment would crack the foundation of Japanese air supremacy. 3 years of dominance was about to crumble. The Zero pilot watched the twin-engine aircraft gain altitude rapidly. His radio crackled with confused voices from other Japanese pilots. Twin-engine twin-tails climbing like nothing we have seen. These words would echo through the halls of Rommel headquarters. His squadron commander would struggle to believe the report. Through scratched plexiglass, the Japanese pilot witnessed aerial impossibility. American P-38 Lightning fighters were climbing faster than his Mitsubishi A6M-20 could match. Intelligence had dismissed these aircraft as heavy and clumsy. The reality climbing toward him told a different story entirely. His Zero had ruled Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. No Allied fighter had matched its performance in China. The Philippines had fallen to Zero dominance, but here above this contested island, something had changed. American pilots in twin-engine fighters were dictating combat terms from unreachable altitudes. The morning sun glinted off polished aluminum wings. The P-38s from the 339th Squadron positioned themselves like hawks above prey. Their altitude advantage was overwhelming. The Zero's legendary turning ability meant nothing at these heights. Mathematics was rewriting aerial supremacy in real time. 3 Japanese aircraft fell that morning to lightning attacks. The victories came from altitudes that rendered traditional dogfighting obsolete. Superior climb performance was demolishing every assumption about air combat. The rising sun's confidence was fading fast. Japanese air superiority had been cracking since early 1942. Few in the Imperial Navy recognized the signs. Since December 7, 1941, naval aviators had swept across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum. Victory bred dangerous overconfidence. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 possessed incredible range for its time. Its tight turning radius had earned fearsome respect. Trained pilots made it deadly in traditional combat. Maximum speed reached 332 miles per hour at critical altitude. This performance had seemed unbeatable for months. Elite pilots like Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai embodied Zero superiority. His victory tally included multiple confirmed kills. China campaign experience had hardened his skills. Countless engagements had refined his tactics. By 1942, Sakai had claimed 13 victories in Borneo alone. Transfer to Lae, New Guinea brought new opportunities. He would eventually claim 64 victories total. His confidence matched that of his fellow pilots. Absolute belief in their aircraft and training defined their mindset. This certainty would soon face harsh reality. Lieutenant Junichi Sasai commanded with equal conviction. He briefed his pilots before each mission with calm authority. The American fighters over Guadalcanal came from carrier forces supporting the invasion. They were probably regular Navy fighters. Army planes seemed unlikely. Japanese intelligence expected to face F-4F Wildcats again. These carrier fighters had been defeated before. Early 1942 victories had reinforced this expectation. Zero pilots had shot down obsolete Brewster Buffaloes over Singapore with ease. Curtiss P-40 Warhawks had fallen over Java like autumn leaves. British hurricanes over Burma had provided little challenge. The Zero maintained nearly complete dominance across the Pacific theater. Even newer Allied fighters couldn't shake Japanese psychological advantage. Superior training and tactics refined through years of China combat kept them ahead. But disturbing intelligence reports filtered back to squadrons by mid-1942. Something different was coming. A new American fighter, unlike anything seen before. Twin engines powered the mystery aircraft. Twin tails distinguished its silhouette. Heavy nose-mounted armament concentrated devastating firepower. Most squadron commanders dismissed these reports entirely. How could any twin-engine fighter threaten the nimble Zero? Japanese naval doctrine built on decisive battle concepts had no framework for understanding what approached. Individual combat skill was everything. Technology was secondary. The Lightning emerged from Lockheed's drawing boards like a thunderbolt. It represented the only truly successful twin-engine day fighter of the entire war. February 1937 brought a demanding U.S. Army Air Corps specification. They wanted a long-range interceptor with unprecedented performance. Designer Clarence Kelly Johnson accepted the challenge enthusiastically. His team created something revolutionary. Their fighter exceeded 400 miles per hour easily. It climbed to 40,000 feet without strain. Fuel capacity allowed missions exceeding 1,000 miles range. Twin Allison V1710 engines provided the power foundation. Each engine produced 1,150 horsepower with turbo supercharging. These performance characteristics seemed impossible to Japanese engineers. The Zero had been designed for maximum maneuverability with minimum weight. Early models lacked armor protection entirely. Self-sealing fuel tanks were omitted to save weight. The Lightning represented completely different design philosophy. Speed, altitude, firepower, and survivability took precedence over turning ability. American engineering priorities differed fundamentally from Japanese approaches. This philosophical gap would prove decisive in combat. First P-38s arrived in the Pacific theater without celebration. Mechanical problems plagued early deliveries. Design issues delayed their combat introduction significantly. When initial aircraft reached Australia, discovery of multiple problems forced extensive modifications. Combat debut was postponed, while engineers worked frantically. By late 1942, these critical issues were finally resolved. Experienced pilots transitioned from P-40 squadrons to the new fighter. The 49th Fighter Group still flew P-40s, but transition was planned. These veteran pilots brought hard-won experience against Japanese fighters to their new mount. Fatal trial and error had taught them never to turn fight with Zeros. The P-38 would finally give them tools to fight on their own terms. Speed and altitude would replace desperate defensive maneuvering. The psychological impact would be profound for both sides. November 18, 1942, brought the Lightning's baptism of fire. Pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron lifted off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Their mission was escorting Boeing B-17 flying Fortress bombers. The results would stun combatants on both sides completely. Japanese pilots flying bomber escort first spotted the strange twin-boomed silhouettes climbing from the south. Initial reactions mixed confusion with disbelief. Were these bombers approaching? Reconnaissance aircraft seemed more likely given their size. The rapid climb rate suggested neither possibility was correct. Recognition came too late for effective response. By the time Japanese pilots identified them as fighters, the P-38s had gained 5,000 feet of altitude advantage. This vertical separation meant tactical defeat for the escort Zeros. They could not climb fast enough to engage effectively. P-38s patrolled at altitudes where Zeros could barely operate. Their great speed at high altitude allowed perfect positioning for attacks. The big fighters plunged from clear sky like avenging angels. Hapless Zero pilots found themselves under assault from impossible angles. Mathematics told the brutal story clearly. Zero low-speed maneuverability was indeed legendary throughout the Pacific. But high-speed maneuverability was actually inferior to P-38 performance at altitude. Above 250 miles per hour, Zero controls became increasingly heavy and unresponsive. Above 300 miles per hour, the aircraft became genuinely difficult to maneuver at all. Pilots had to use both hands on the control stick. The P-38, with hydraulically boosted controls in later models, maintained full effectiveness. High-speed dives approaching 500 miles per hour posed no control problems. The technological chasm was wider than mere performance numbers suggested. Japanese pilots experienced shock that went beyond simple aircraft comparison. P-38s represented fundamentally different approaches to aerial warfare. Japanese military culture had never anticipated this philosophical shift toward technology over skill. Lightning armament concentrated devastating power in a focused stream. 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon fired from the nose. This arrangement eliminated complex gun convergence calculations required by wing-mounted weapons. Every round traveled the same path toward the target. Turbo-supercharged engines were equally revolutionary to Japanese understanding. P-38 turbo-superchargers enabled excellent high-altitude performance while also muffling exhaust noise. Lightning operations remained relatively quiet compared to other fighters. Japanese pilots often never heard P-38s approaching until too late. The Zero's Nakajima-Sakai engine produced 950 horsepower at sea level. Power output dropped dramatically with altitude gain. By 20,000 feet, it produced barely 750 horsepower. Performance degradation was severe and unavoidable. P-38 turbo-supercharged Allisons maintained power output to much higher altitudes. This gave them overwhelming advantage in the vertical dimension of aerial combat. Japanese pilots found themselves fighting uphill battles, literally and figuratively. The sky belonged to American technology now. Psychological impact on Japanese pilots became evident by early 1943. Squadron reports reflected growing anxiety among aircrew. Personal letters home revealed deepening concerns about survival. The mythology of Zero invincibility was crumbling under repeated defeats. Japanese pilots spoke constantly of tension and dread. P-38s could strike from anywhere without warning. The stress was becoming unbearable for many experienced pilots. Their confident swagger was replaced by nervous glances skyward. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima encountered the famous double-team maneuver that would define American tactics. Two Wildcats had jumped his aircraft during a routine patrol. He easily got on the tail of one enemy fighter. Victory seemed certain within seconds, but he never got a chance to fire his guns. The Wildcat's teammate roared at him from the side with guns blazing. Nakajima was forced to break off his attack immediately. He dove for safety while cursing his predicament loudly. Nakajima was raging when he returned to Rabaul Airfield. Being forced to run from American fighters violated every principle of his training. This humiliating experience against Wildcats paled compared to what P-38s would bring. The Lightning was infinitely more dangerous than any previous American fighter. Saburo Sakai himself would eventually admit the devastating truth. It was no longer possible for Zero fighters to successfully engage P-38s under normal circumstances. Only the most unusual conditions offered any hope of victory. Unfortunately, such conditions seldom presented themselves in actual combat. This admission from Japan's most famous ace carried crushing weight throughout the pilot community. If Sakai couldn't defeat P-38s, then ordinary pilots had no chance at all. The psychological damage was incalculable for squadron morale. Tactical reality was even worse than individual combat statistics suggested. P-38 range meant it could appear anywhere across the vast Pacific theater. With a range of 1,600 miles using drop tanks, the Lightning escorted bombers deep into Japanese territory. Fighter sweeps could reach far from American bases. Japanese pilots could no longer count on numerical superiority even over their own airfields. The sanctuary of distance had been eliminated by American technology. Nowhere was safe from Lightning attacks anymore. Operation Vengeance on April 18, 1943, demonstrated P-38 superiority most dramatically. 16 Lightnings flew a 435-mile interception mission to shoot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The mission required precise navigation over open ocean. Extreme range pushed aircraft to their limits. Successful engagement of both bombers and fighter escorts was essential. Major John Mitchell led the mission with calculated precision. Aircraft flew at 50 feet above ocean surface to avoid radar detection. Then they climbed rapidly to interception altitude at exactly the right moment. Navigation had to be perfect, or the mission would fail completely. Psychological impact on Japanese naval aviation was utterly devastating. Their most revered leader, traveling with 60 escorts, had been hunted down like a common criminal. American fighters operating at extreme range had executed him with surgical precision. The message was unmistakable. Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya had flown in Yamamoto's fighter escort that morning. His testimony revealed the complete shock experienced by Japanese pilots during the attack. Lightning pilots appeared from nowhere, like ghosts. They executed their attack with mathematical precision, then escaped before Zero escorts could respond effectively. American pilots had calculated the interception timing to the exact minute. They arrived when Yamamoto's flight was most vulnerable during descent for landing. This level of operational planning, combined with P-38 performance, represented capabilities Japan simply could not match anymore. As 1943 progressed, American pilots refined tactics to maximize P-38 advantages completely. Boom and zoom attacks became standard operating procedure. Diving from altitude, firing, then climbing away before enemy reaction was possible. Japanese pilots found themselves helpless against these systematic tactics. First encounters between Japanese and P-38s resulted in 15 Japanese aircraft shot down to only one P-38 lost. These lopsided victory ratios became increasingly common as American pilots gained experience. The performance gap was simply too wide to bridge through skill alone. Japanese forces attempted various countermeasures desperately. Dive breaks were used to force overshooting attacks. They tried luring P-38s into low-altitude turning fights where Zeros might have advantages. New loose formations were developed to spot incoming attacks earlier. Nothing worked consistently against determined Lightning pilots. The performance gap was mathematically insurmountable. Japanese tactics could not overcome American technological superiority. The war in the air was being decided by engineering rather than courage. P-38 superiority reflected deeper truths about American industrial capability. Japanese pilots were beginning to grasp the magnitude of their disadvantage. By war's end, over 10,000 P-38s would roll from production lines. 18 distinct models represented continuous improvement throughout the conflict. Each new variant addressed weaknesses while enhancing existing strengths. Combat experience drove constant refinement. The P-38J model, arriving in late 1943, incorporated hydraulically boosted ailerons for improved roll rate. Cockpit heating issues plaguing European operations were resolved. Improved turbo superchargers provided even better altitude performance than previous models. Japanese aircraft development, meanwhile, struggled to produce any meaningful improvements to basic Zero design. Resources and engineering talent were stretched too thin. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind Pearl Harbor attack, privately admitted to colleagues by mid-1943. "We face not just a superior fighter, but a system of continuous improvement we cannot match. Each new American fighter encountered is better than the previous model." The technological gap was amplified by diverging pilot quality standards. By mid-1943, Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than replacement training could produce them. Pilot attrition had become a death spiral for Japanese aviation. Training programs were shortened from 2 years to less than 6 months. New pilots arrived at combat units with less than 200 hours total flight time. They were lambs being led to slaughter by experienced American opponents. American pilots conversely arrived with 400 to 600 hours of comprehensive training. They practiced combat tactics in advanced training units. Gun camera footage from actual combat was studied extensively. Multiple aircraft types provided broad experience base. When transitioning to P-38s, they received specialized training in twin-engine operations. High-altitude combat tactics were practiced repeatedly. By the time they reached combat units, they were thoroughly prepared for war. P-38 twin-engine configuration provided critical advantages Japanese pilots hadn't fully appreciated initially. Survivability was paramount over vast Pacific distances. With 2 engines even severely damaged, Lightnings could limp home on single-propeller power. Psychological impact of this reliability was profound for American pilot morale. Japanese pilots flying single-engine aircraft over endless ocean faced death if their engine failed. Zero extreme range came at cost of minimal armor and basic fuel tanks. A single bullet in wrong location meant fiery death or long swim in shark-infested waters. This constant stress affected Japanese pilot performance and decision-making throughout combat operations. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence warned pilots to avoid duels with Lightnings at all costs. Reports noted their terrifying diving speed and pinpoint accuracy. Ability to appear unexpectedly made them impossible to counter effectively. Intelligence reports circulated among Japanese squadrons revealed growing understanding of their tactical disadvantage. One captured document from December 1943 stated clearly, "The P-38 type fighter must be considered the most dangerous American aircraft in Pacific operations. Its speed and climb rate exceed anything we can currently achieve. Engagement should be avoided unless possessing overwhelming numerical superiority and advantageous position." This admission represented complete reversal of warrior ethic defining Japanese naval aviation. Psychological damage was devastating for squadron morale. Pilots trained to seek combat at every opportunity were now told to run from the enemy. This contradicted every principle of their military culture and personal honor. American P-38 aces provided stark evidence of fighter superiority over Japanese opposition. Major Richard Bong became America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories. All were scored flying P-38 Lightnings exclusively. Major Thomas McGuire achieved 38 victories before being killed in January 1945. These scores, accomplished in less than 2 years of combat, exceeded what most Japanese aces achieved in 3 or 4 years of continuous warfare. Over 1,800 Japanese aircraft would eventually fall to P-38s throughout Pacific theater operations. This tally represented more than aircraft destroyed. Each victory eliminated experienced pilots Japan could never adequately replace. Training programs struggled to produce even basically competent replacements. Each P-38 victory diminished Japanese air power exponentially. The mathematics of attrition were working inexorably against Japanese aviation. Time and resources were running out rapidly. As 1944 progressed, P-38 development continued, while Japanese aircraft technology stagnated completely. The P-38L model featured upgraded engines producing even more power at altitude. Improved cooling systems enhanced reliability significantly. Rocket launchers enabled devastating ground attack missions beyond air superiority roles. These aircraft carried substantial bomb loads in addition to standard armament. Japanese pilots watched P-38s transition from air superiority to ground attack with growing despair. They faced not just superior fighter, but versatile weapon system of unprecedented capability. American engineering had solved multiple problems simultaneously, while Japanese development remained focused on incremental zero improvements. Beyond technological superiority, Japanese pilots struggled to comprehend American approaches to air combat entirely. Japanese culture had elevated aerial combat to high art form. Individual skill and warrior spirit were paramount values. Americans treated air combat as engineering problem requiring systematic solution. Superior technology and refined tactics mattered more than personal courage. This philosophical difference was insurmountable for Japanese military culture. Commander Masatake Okumiya analyzed combat reports extensively after the war. We could not accept that fighting spirit alone was insufficient against superior technology. Every report of P-38 superiority was met with demands for greater dedication and more aggressive warrior spirit. We confused courage with capability consistently. This cultural blindness prevented effective adaptation to changing tactical realities. While American pilots refined tactics based on combat experience, Japanese training emphasized aerobatic skill and individual prowess. These skills proved useless against enemies refusing to engage on traditional terms. Honor meant nothing against mathematics and engineering superiority. By mid-1944, some P-38s carried primitive airborne radar for night fighting operations. This technology was completely beyond Japanese capability to match or effectively counter. Night had previously provided sanctuary for Japanese operations. Now, even darkness offered no protection from American hunters. The sky belonged to America around the clock. Japanese pilots had nowhere to hide anymore. While P-38s didn't participate directly in the Battle of Philippine Sea during June 1944, their impact was clearly evident. Years of attrition against Lightnings and other American fighters had eliminated Japan's experienced pilot cadre completely. The Marianas Turkey Shoot saw American Navy pilots shoot down over 300 Japanese aircraft for minimal losses. This represented culmination of processes P-38s had accelerated throughout 1943. Japanese aviation was hollow shell of former strength. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding Japanese carrier forces, admitted complete defeat afterward. Our pilots were simply not ready for combat operations. They possessed neither experience nor adequate aircraft to match American capabilities. The war in the air had been lost long before that decisive day. P-38 Lightning had struck the killing blow against Japanese air superiority over Pacific skies. Panic drove Japanese innovation by the end of 1944. As winter approached and 1945 loomed ahead, desperation consumed Japanese military planners. Their attempts to counter the Lightning became wild experiments born from hopelessness. They knew conventional air combat meant certain death. So they tried ramming attacks instead. Pilots received orders to sacrifice their lives by flying directly into P-38s. These kamikaze tactics showed how completely the Lightning had broken Japanese confidence in normal fighter combat. Engineers worked frantically on phosphorus shells. These special anti-aircraft rounds targeted the P-38's fuel system specifically. Japanese gunners hoped phosphorus would ignite American fuel tanks where regular shells failed. The very existence of these specialized weapons proved how deeply the Lightning had penetrated Japanese fears. Twin-engine projects sprouted in Japanese factories. Designers scrambled to copy the P-38's basic configuration. If Americans could build twin-boom fighters, surely Japan could match them. But these projects revealed the enormous technological gap that separated the two nations. The Kawasaki K-102 represented Japan's most serious attempt at matching the Lightning. This twin-engine fighter was supposed to restore Japanese air superiority. Instead, it became a monument to Japanese technological limitations. Development dragged on for years while P-38s dominated Pacific skies. The Lightning had been shooting down Japanese planes since 1941. The K-102 didn't reach squadrons until 1945. By then, the war was nearly over. Only 238 K-102s ever rolled off production lines. Each one cost precious resources Japan couldn't spare. The few that reached combat units disappointed their pilots immediately. Speed tests showed the K-102 was slower than the Lightning it was meant to counter. Climb performance was embarrassing. While P-38 soared to 44,000 feet, the K-102 struggled at lower altitudes. Its engines overheated constantly. Oil pressure dropped during combat maneuvers. Maintenance crews spent more time repairing K-102s than flying them. The aircraft that was supposed to restore Japanese pride became another source of humiliation. Test pilots reported that the K-102 handled poorly compared to the Lightning. Controls felt sluggish. Response was delayed. The twin engines that should have provided power advantage instead created problems Japanese engineers couldn't solve. Air superiority became a forgotten dream by early 1945. Japanese pilots no longer spoke of controlling the skies. They no longer planned offensive missions or discussed tactical advantages. Conversation focused on one thing only: survival. The P-38 had joined other American fighters in creating complete aerial dominance. Japanese airspace belonged to the Americans now. Zero pilots looked up at Lightning formations, cruising at altitudes they couldn't reach. The psychological impact was devastating. Even Saburo Sakai admitted defeat. This legendary ace who had survived countless battles made a stunning confession after the war. The P-38 destroyed the morale of the Zero fighter pilot completely. These words from Japan's greatest surviving ace carried enormous weight. Statistics told the brutal story of P-38 dominance in the Pacific theater. The numbers were staggering and undeniable. Over 1,800 Japanese aircraft fell to Lightning guns during the war. Each victory represented a Japanese pilot who would never return home. Major Richard Bong became America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories. Every single kill came while flying P-38s. His success demonstrated the Lightning's superiority in skilled hands. Bong's tactics of high-speed passes and zoom climbs were impossible in lesser aircraft. Major Thomas Maguire achieved 38 victories flying P-38s exclusively. His aggressive fighting style maximized the Lightning's advantages. Maguire would dive from a high altitude, fire deadly accurate bursts, then climb back beyond Japanese reach. This hit-and-run approach demoralized enemy pilots. P-38 squadrons claimed more Japanese aircraft than any other Army Air Force fighter type. The Lightning's combination of speed, firepower, and range made it the ultimate Japanese aircraft killer. No other American fighter matched its record of destruction. Japanese loss rates painted a grim picture of aerial slaughter. By war's end, over 90% of experienced Japanese pilots who began the conflict were dead. The men who had attacked Pearl Harbor and conquered Southeast Asia were gone. Their replacements were barely trained teenagers. The average Japanese pilot in 1945 had logged less than 100 hours of flight time. These were not the seasoned warriors of 1941. They were sacrificial offerings sent against an enemy they had no hope of defeating. Many died on their first combat mission. American occupation forces conducted extensive interviews after Japan's surrender. These conversations revealed the full psychological devastation the P-38 had inflicted on Japanese aviators. The truth was more shocking than anyone had imagined. Commander Masatake Okumiya spoke with painful honesty about the lightning's impact. The P-38 broke our confidence completely, he admitted. We had believed in our superiority. We trusted in our aircraft and our training. The lightning showed us we were wrong about everything. This wasn't just about speed or firepower, Okumiya continued. The P-38 represented a completely different approach to warfare. It embodied systematic thinking and industrial might that Japan couldn't hope to match. Every encounter reinforced Japanese inferiority. One unnamed Japanese pilot described his first lightning encounter in vivid detail. On my first confrontation with the P-38, I was astonished completely. Here was an American aircraft that could outrun, outclimb, and outdive our Zero. We had believed our fighter was the most superior in the world. The shock of discovering Japanese aircraft were obsolete, shattered pilot confidence. These men had trained for years believing in Zero superiority. Meeting the lightning destroyed that faith instantly. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for such technological inferiority. Post-war technical analysis revealed the enormous performance gap between Japanese and American fighters. The numbers were devastating when compared side by side. Every specification showed Japanese aircraft lagging far behind. The Mitsubishi A6M0 could reach 332 miles per hour at its critical altitude. This speed had seemed impressive in 1941. By 1943, it was pathetically slow compared to American fighters. The Zero's service ceiling was 33,000 feet on paper. In practice, it struggled badly above 25,000 feet. Zero climb rate reached 3,100 feet per minute under ideal conditions. This decreased rapidly as altitude increased. At high altitudes, where P-38s operated best, Zeros could barely climb at all. Their engines gasped for air in the thin atmosphere. Range was the Zero's only advantage at 1930 miles. This exceptional distance capability had enabled Pearl Harbor and early conquests, but range meant nothing when the aircraft couldn't fight effectively upon arrival. Zero armament consisted of two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons. Ammunition loads were limited. The small machine guns were nearly useless against American aircraft. Even the cannons lacked stopping power compared to American weapons. Early Zero models had no armor protection whatsoever. Pilots sat in unprotected cockpits. Fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A single burst from enemy guns could turn a Zero into a fireball instantly. The Lockheed P-38L Lightning achieved over 400 miles per hour in level flight. This speed advantage was decisive in combat. Japanese pilots simply could not escape when Lightning pilots chose to attack. Nor could they catch P-38s that wanted to disengage. Lightning service ceiling reached 44,000 feet comfortably. At this altitude, P-38 pilots looked down on Japanese formations below, like hawks eyeing prey. They could choose when and where to attack with complete impunity. P-38 climb rate hit 4750 feet per minute at sea level. This allowed rapid altitude changes during combat. Lightning pilots could zoom climb after attacks, gaining height faster than Japanese fighters could follow. Range with drop tanks extended to 1,600 miles. This gave P-38 strategic reach across the vast Pacific. They could escort bombers to distant targets and return home safely. Lightning armament was devastating. 450 caliber machine guns provided massive firepower. The single 20mm cannon added explosive punch. All weapons were concentrated in the nose for pinpoint accuracy. Lightning pilots aimed where they looked. Armor protection was extensive throughout the aircraft. Pilots sat behind thick armor plate. Critical systems were shielded from enemy fire. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires. P-38 pilots could survive hits that would destroy Japanese aircraft. These specifications revealed a complete mismatch between opposing fighters. The Zero had been designed for a different kind of war. Its creators envisioned aerial combat as individual duels where pilot skill determined victory. The P-38 represented industrial-age warfare. Technology, production capacity, and systematic improvement determined outcomes. Individual heroics meant nothing against overwhelming technological superiority. American industrial might dwarfed Japanese manufacturing capacity completely. Lockheed produced over 1,000 P-38s during the war years. Assembly lines churned out Lightnings faster than Japan could train replacement pilots. Japan built approximately 20,000 Zeros total during the entire war. Production was spread over a longer period. Quality declined steadily as shortages worsened and experienced workers were drafted. Late-war Zeros were inferior to early models. American production methods used assembly line techniques perfected in automobile manufacturing. Standardized components and precise tolerances ensured consistent quality. Each P-38 incorporated thousands of specialized parts manufactured to exacting standards. Japanese aircraft production remained largely traditional. Individual craftsmen hand-fitted components. Each plane was slightly different. This approach worked for small numbers, but couldn't scale to wartime requirements. The Allison engines powering P-38s were engineering masterpieces. Supercharging technology provided high-altitude performance. Precision manufacturing ensured reliability. Advanced metallurgy created engines that could run at high-power settings continuously. Japanese engines required extensive hand-fitting and constant adjustment. Mechanics spent hours tuning each engine. Reliability was poor compared to American standards. Japanese pilots never knew if their engines would fail during critical moments. American engines were essentially interchangeable between aircraft. This simplified maintenance dramatically. Mechanics could swap engines quickly when repairs were needed. Combat units maintained high operational readiness despite primitive field conditions. The training gap had become a chasm by 1944. American and Japanese pilot preparation differed as dramatically as their aircraft. The disparity showed in combat results immediately. American P-38 pilots received comprehensive twin-engine training. They logged over 100 hours on twin-engine trainers before approaching a Lightning. This preparation was thorough and systematic. Engine-out procedures were practiced until they became instinctive. Pilots learned to handle asymmetric thrust situations safely. Single-engine landings were routine training events. This preparation saved many lives when combat damage occurred. High-altitude physiology training prepared pilots for operations above 3,000 feet. Oxygen system management was thoroughly covered. Pilots understood the dangers of altitude and how to avoid them. Gunnery training used camera guns and towed targets extensively. Pilots practiced deflection shooting until it became natural. Combat accuracy reflected this intensive preparation. Formation tactics and mutual support procedures were emphasized heavily. American pilots learned to fight as teams. Individual heroics were discouraged in favor of coordinated attacks. escape and evasion training prepared pilots for survival behind enemy lines. They learned jungle survival, navigation, and communication techniques. This training helped many downed pilots return to friendly forces. Aircraft systems knowledge was comprehensive. Pilots understood every switch, gauge, and control in their aircraft. This knowledge allowed maximum utilization of the P-38's capabilities. Japanese training by 1944 had deteriorated to dangerous levels. Basic flight instruction rarely exceeded 100 hours total. Many pilots reached combat units with barely enough skill to take off and land safely. Combat tactics training was minimal when it existed at all. Pilots learned through trial and error in actual combat. Most died before gaining meaningful experience. Gunnery practice was severely limited by ammunition shortages. Many pilots reached combat units having fired their guns only a few times. Their shooting accuracy reflected this lack of preparation. High-altitude training was non-existent. Japanese pilots had never experienced the conditions where P-38s operated best. They were helpless when forced to fight at extreme altitudes. Emphasis on spirit over tactical doctrine dominated Japanese training philosophy. Pilots were taught that courage and determination would overcome any disadvantage. This proved tragically wrong against American technology. Preparation for special attack missions consumed increasing training time. By 1945, many pilots were trained primarily for kamikaze attacks rather than conventional combat. The predictable result was wholesale slaughter. American pilots arrived at combat units as skilled professionals ready for war. Japanese pilots arrived as barely competent sacrifices offered to superior technology. The P-38 forced revolutionary changes in aerial combat tactics. Traditional turning dogfights that had dominated aerial combat since World War I became obsolete overnight. While the P-38 could not outturn an A6M0 at low speeds, its superior performance in other areas made turning unnecessary. American pilots developed energy tactics that maximized their advantages while avoiding Japanese strengths. The high-side pass became the standard lightning attack method. Pilots approached from above and behind enemy formations. They dived through Japanese aircraft with guns blazing. Then they zoomed back to altitude before defenders could react. This tactic was impossible without the P-38's performance advantages. Speed allowed the initial approach. Firepower delivered devastating damage during the brief firing pass. Climb performance carried the Lightning beyond Japanese reach afterward. Japanese defensive formations became useless against these tactics. Traditional defensive circles and mutual support maneuvers assumed opponents would engage in turning combat. P-38s simply ignored these formations and attacked from above. The Japanese attempted counter-tactics by stationing fighters at multiple altitudes. This approach dispersed their already limited forces. Coordination between altitude layers proved impossible with primitive radio equipment. They tried using clouds for concealment from high-flying P-38s, but the Lightning's speed allowed it to cover vast areas quickly. Japanese aircraft were found wherever they attempted to hide. The Lightning's distinctive twin-boom design became a psychological weapon in itself. Japanese pilots initially dismissed the unusual configuration as heavy and clumsy. This unique silhouette soon became a symbol of technological terror. The aircraft's alien appearance looked nothing like conventional fighters. Japanese pilots had never seen anything like it. This unfamiliarity added to the psychological impact of superior performance. Ground crews reported that mere rumors of P-38s in the area would delay Japanese missions. Pilots requested additional escorts when Lightning presence was suspected. The psychological effect multiplied the P-38's tactical impact. Japanese pilots nicknamed the aircraft 2 planes, 1 pilot. This name reflected confusion about the twin boom design. It also showed grudging respect for the Lightning's capabilities. The P-38's superiority had strategic implications far beyond tactical air combat. Japanese military planning had assumed rough air parity would allow their superior warrior spirit to prevail in prolonged combat. The Lightning demonstrated that technology could create such overwhelming advantage that spirit became completely irrelevant. This realization influenced Japanese strategic decisions at the highest levels. Acceleration of kamikaze tactics resulted directly from P-38 dominance. When conventional air combat became hopeless, suicide attacks seemed the only alternative. Young pilots were sent to die because they couldn't compete in normal combat. Withdrawal of remaining experienced pilots to home island defense stripped overseas commands of their best aviators. These irreplaceable veterans were hoarded for the final battle that never came. Abandonment of offensive air operations occurred by mid-1944. Japanese forces could no longer mount meaningful attacks against American positions. The P-38 and other American fighters had eliminated their offensive capability. Diversion of resources to desperate wonder weapon projects consumed materials needed for conventional aircraft. Jet fighters, rocket interceptors, and other experimental designs received priority over proven designs. Recognition that the war was unwinnable by conventional means spread through Japanese leadership. The P-38's dominance proved that Japan lacked the technology to compete with American industrial might. Admiral Soemu Toyoda commanded the combined fleet during the final war years. His private acknowledgment in October 1944 was brutally honest. "We no longer have an air force capable of conventional operations. The American fighters, especially the P-38, have eliminated our ability to contest the skies." The P-38's twin-engine complexity initially worried American planners. Maintenance requirements seemed excessive for combat conditions. Instead, the Lightning demonstrated another crushing American advantage in sophisticated logistics capabilities. P-38 squadrons consistently maintained operational rates exceeding 80%, even in primitive Pacific conditions. These figures were remarkable for any aircraft. For a complex twin-engine fighter, they were unprecedented. Japanese units flying simpler single-engine fighters struggled to maintain 50% availability by 1944. Their supposedly simple aircraft required more maintenance than American complex fighters. American maintenance crews brought systematic approaches learned from civilian aviation and automotive industries. Many mechanics had worked on commercial aircraft or automobiles before the war. They understood mechanical systems intuitively. Specialized tools were developed for common P-38 maintenance tasks. Standardized procedures ensured consistent results, regardless of who performed the work. Preventive maintenance schedules prevented failures before they occurred. Japanese maintenance remained traditional and individualistic. Master mechanics passed knowledge to apprentices through years of observation. This approach worked peacetime, but failed under wartime pressure. The navigation technology gap between American and Japanese aircraft was enormous. P-38s carried radio direction finding equipment that provided accurate navigation over vast Pacific distances. Pilots could home in on radio beacons from hundreds of miles away. They could find their bases in poor weather conditions. Precise time-on-target attacks became routine operations. Japanese pilots relied primarily on dead reckoning and visual navigation techniques. These methods worked over familiar territory in good weather. They failed completely during long-range missions over open ocean. This navigation advantage became critical during extended operations. The famous Yamamoto interception mission required precise navigation over 435 miles of open ocean. American pilots had to arrive at exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Japanese pilots couldn't have executed such a mission with their available technology. Their navigation limitations restricted operational flexibility severely. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire strategic doctrine around naval aviation superiority. Carrier air groups were expected to control the seas around Japanese positions. The P-38's dominance shattered this fundamental assumption. Carrier air groups rebuilt after Midway losses were systematically destroyed by P-38s and other American fighters during subsequent island campaigns. Each engagement reduced Japanese strength further. By 1944, Japanese carriers sailed with half-strength air groups filled with poorly trained pilots. These formations were shadows of the elite units that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the first mobile fleet during its final operations. His assessment before the Battle of the Philippine Sea was devastatingly honest. Our pilots are not ready for combat against American fighters. They can barely land on carriers, much less fight P-38s and Hellcats. We are sending them to certain death. The encounter with P-38s forced fundamental transformation in Japanese military thinking. The Bushido Code, emphasizing spiritual strength and individual warrior prowess, proved completely inadequate against American industrial warfare. Younger Japanese officers began questioning the entire foundation of Japanese military doctrine. If technology could overcome spirit so completely, what did this mean for Japanese identity? This cultural transformation extended far beyond military circles. Japanese pilots returning from combat brought stories of American technological superiority that contradicted years of propaganda about Western decadence and Japanese spiritual superiority. The P-38 program represented an economic investment Japan couldn't hope to match. Each Lightning cost approximately $97,000 in 1944 currency. This was expensive even by American standards, but the United States produced thousands of them. Japan struggled to produce aircraft costing a fraction of that amount in meaningful numbers. The aluminum required for a single P-38 exceeded what many Japanese aircraft factories received in an entire month by 1944. Precision instruments, turbochargers, and constant-speed propellers represented industrial capabilities Japan had never developed. Each component required specialized manufacturing techniques and materials beyond Japanese reach. The most powerful evidence of P-38 2-hate impact comes from Japanese pilot testimonies collected after the war. These men had been trained never to admit weakness or defeat. Yet they universally acknowledged lightning superiority in post-war interviews. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai provided the most detailed account of P-38. T-38 encounters. The P-38 would patrol above the altitude at which the Zero could operate effectively. Their great speed at high altitudes allowed them to maneuver into the most advantageous attack positions. Then the big fighters would plunge from the sky to smash into hapless Zero formations. We were helpless against these tactics. Speed and altitude gave them complete control over when and where combat occurred. Perhaps the greatest humiliation came not from combat losses, but from the P-38's reconnaissance capabilities. Photo reconnaissance variants obtained 90% of aerial photography in the Pacific theater. Japanese positions, troop movements, and defensive preparations were constantly observed and recorded. The same aircraft dominating them in combat was also mapping their defeat in precise detail. Japanese commanders realized their every move was being watched and photographed. Strategic surprise became impossible when P-38s overhead recorded everything. The P-38 F-5 photo reconnaissance variant was stripped of weapons but retained full performance capabilities. These aircraft could photograph Japanese installations with complete impunity. Interceptors sent against them simply couldn't reach their operational altitude. The shock Japanese pilots experienced when encountering P-38s extended far beyond the war itself. It influenced post-war Japanese aviation development, military doctrine, and cultural attitudes toward technology versus tradition. Many surviving Japanese pilots became advocates for technological advancement in post-war Japan. They had learned through bitter experience that courage without capability was meaningless in modern warfare. Their experiences influenced Japan's post-war embrace of technology and industrial development. The nation that had trusted in spiritual strength learned to compete through technological excellence instead. Saburo Sakai became a successful businessman after the war. He often spoke about lessons learned from facing the lightning in combat. The P-38 taught us that we must never again fall behind technologically. It showed us that industrial power, not warrior spirit, determines victory in modern war. The P-38's continuous evolution during wartime demonstrated American advantages in rapid technical innovation. Problems identified in combat were quickly addressed in new production models. Compressibility issues at high speed led to development of dive flaps. Cold cockpit complaints resulted in improved heating systems. Roll rate limitations were addressed with hydraulically boosted ailerons. Japanese aircraft development was constrained by limited resources and institutional rigidity. Innovation proceeded slowly, when it occurred at all. The Zero that fought in 1945 was essentially the same aircraft that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Minor improvements were incorporated over time, but fundamental design limitations couldn't be overcome. The P-38L Lightning of 1945 was dramatically superior to the P-38E of 1942. General George Kenney commanded Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific Theater. His assessment of P-38 operations was succinct and accurate. P-38 pilots flying at great height chose when and where they wanted to fight, with disastrous results for Japanese pilots. This ability to dictate engagement terms represented a revolution in air combat that Japanese military doctrine never successfully countered. Traditional concepts of aerial warfare became obsolete overnight. Final statistics were overwhelming in their implications. By war's end, the two top American aces had shot down 78 Japanese aircraft between them, all while flying P-38s exclusively. The top surviving Japanese ace had accumulated 64 victories over 6 years of continuous warfare. The mathematics of attrition were clearly unsustainable for Japan. The P-38's dominance over the Zero represented far more than simple technological superiority. It demonstrated fundamental differences in approaches to warfare, industrial capacity, innovation culture, and strategic thinking. Japan had prepared for a short, decisive war, where warrior spirit would overcome material disadvantages. The P-38 represented American preparation for a long industrial war, where technology and production capacity would prove ultimately decisive. The psychological shock experienced by Japanese pilots encountering the Lightning was really the shock of encountering industrial modernity itself. The P-38 represented systematic application of science, engineering, and industrial management to warfare. Against this systematic approach, the samurai tradition, however noble and inspiring, proved completely helpless. Individual courage couldn't bridge the technological gap that American industry had created. Behind the cold statistics and technical specifications lay enormous human tragedy. Thousands of young Japanese pilots, many with less than 100 hours of total flight time, were sent against P-38s in obsolescent aircraft. They understood they had no realistic chance of survival. Their final letters home, discovered after the war, revealed young men resigned to death, but determined to fulfill their duty. One young pilot wrote to his mother before his final mission, "Mother, I will face the twin-tailed devils tomorrow morning." I do not expect to return home. They fly higher and faster than we can imagine. I will do my duty as trained, but I know the situation is hopeless. He was shot down by P-38s over Rabaul in March 1944. His story was repeated thousands of times throughout the Pacific War. Young lives were sacrificed to a technological gap that no amount of courage could overcome. The P-38's influence extended far beyond World War II itself. It influenced Cold War aircraft development programs in both the United States and Soviet Union. Twin-engine, high-altitude interceptors based on Lightning lessons became standard defensive weapons. The concept of using overwhelming technology to create decisive advantage became central to American military doctrine throughout the Cold War and beyond. For Japan, the traumatic experience influenced post-war self-defense forces to prioritize quality over quantity. Advanced technology became preferred over mass mobilization. The trauma of technological inferiority left permanent marks on Japanese military thinking. The shock Japanese pilots experienced when they discovered they could not outrun or outclimb the P-38 Lightning marked the end of an entire era in aerial warfare. The age of individual warrior pilots, where personal skill and courage determined victory, died permanently in Pacific skies. It was replaced by industrial age warfare, where technology, production capacity, and systematic innovation determined outcomes. Saburo Sakai's post-war reflection that the P-38 destroyed the morale of Zero fighter pilots captured the essence of this fundamental transformation. The Lightning wasn't just faster or better armed than Japanese aircraft. It represented a completely different approach to warfare that Japan couldn't hope to match or counter. Japanese pilots who survived the war learned the harshest possible lesson about modern combat. In contemporary warfare, courage without superior technology is not heroism, but futility. Individual bravery cannot overcome systematic technological disadvantage. The P-38 Lightning didn't merely shoot down Japanese aircraft in large numbers. It shattered an entire worldview about warfare, honor, and national power that had sustained Japanese military culture. Their shock upon encountering the Lightning was the shock of discovering that everything they believed about air combat was fundamentally wrong. The Zero, which had seemed invincible in 1941, was completely obsolete by 1943. Pilots who had trained for years in aerobatic combat techniques found their skills utterly useless against an enemy that refused to engage on traditional terms. The twin-tailed devil that haunted Japanese pilots' nightmares represented far more than just a superior fighter aircraft. It embodied American industrial might, technological innovation, and systematic approach to warfare that would define the remainder of the 20th century. The final assessment belongs to Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving fighter ace, who lived to reflect deeply on the war's lessons and their broader implications. The P-38 taught us the hardest lesson imaginable, he concluded. The age of the samurai was finished forever. In the skies over the Pacific, we encountered the future of warfare, and it destroyed us completely. The shock of that encounter continues to reverberate today, serving as a permanent reminder that in warfare's crucible, technology and industrial capacity ultimately triumph over tradition and individual valor, no matter how noble or inspiring. The Japanese pilots who could not outrun or outclimb the P-38 Lightning learned this bitter lesson at the cost of their lives, their aircraft, and ultimately their empire's dreams of Pacific dominance. They had challenged the arsenal of democracy with the ancient spirit of the samurai. The P-38 Lightning was democracy's answer, delivered at 400 miles per hour from 30,000 feet, with devastating precision that no amount of traditional courage could hope to overcome.